Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lit Fic on a Mighty Blaze. The blaze was sparked when COVID-19 extinguished the traditional in-person book tour, and our co-founders, New York Times bestselling authors, Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt, joined forces to promote books that were coming out. Welcome again. I am Bo Ellis. I'm the Facebook director of The Blaze. I'm a writer myself, and I'm also a producer here. This week, we have the amazing author, Rachel Beanland. Rachel is the author of the forthcoming novel, The House is on Fire, that we will be discussing today. You can see it here and in Rachel's background there. It's published by Simon & Schuster in April, so be on the lookout for it soon or pre-ordered at a link I will post in the comments. Her debut novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever, was selected as a book club pick by Barnes & Noble, a featured debut by Amazon, and Indie Next Pick by the American Booksellers Association, and one of the best books of 2020 by USA Today. And it was also named a New York Times Editor's Choice and was recognized with the 2020 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Rachel's writing has also appeared in LitHub, Business Insider, Creative Nonfiction, and Broad Street, among other places. She currently lives in Richmond, Virginia, with her family. So hello, Rachel. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
No, I'm so excited. I read this and it was thrilling. I work at a theater myself, so I think I was a perfect person to review this because this is about the, infamous, the very tragic 1811 Virginia Theater Fire, which claimed a lot of lives, and you can read about some real historical figures in this novel. And one of my first questions was how these people, I know several are real, most of them are real because I read about it. How much did you embellish and how much is like, no, this is straight what really happened?
Yeah, it really depended on the character. They all at least touch a person who lived and breathed in real life. But with some of those people, we know considerably more about them than we do others. So, for instance, we have documentation about the stagehand who was backstage when the fire started. We don't know what his name was. We don't know much about him personally, but we know kind of what happened that night. Mm-hmm. Sally Henry Campbell, because she's the daughter of Patrick Henry, we know a good bit about her family, but we don't necessarily know about what she was thinking. And we kind of know the family legend that was passed down in terms of the fact that she was at the fire and that she survived. We probably know the most about Gilbert Hunt, the enslaved blacksmith who ran towards the fire and ended up saving about a dozen white women from the blaze, because he was documented in several accounts long after the fire. And then the last character, Cecily, she's based on the story, this kind of belief that historians have that a few enslaved individuals may have used the fire as an opportunity to escape slavery. And so she's probably the one where I had to make up the most because, of course, the record does not really support her, not support her existence. But in all cases, I mean, my model is like, I try to stay as true to the history as I can for as long as I possibly can, give as much good detail, as there is to give. And then where the historical record runs out, that's where I have to embellish.
No, and that is so important for authors to do because, as you've mentioned, two of the point of view characters are people who were enslaved at the time, and there's just so little records from those people because of the dominant society not wanting there to be any record of their existence. They just didn't value them. So, did you always know you wanted to include those point of views?
I always knew that I wanted to represent a wide cross-section of the city because the theater was accessible to many different kinds of people. Because you work in theaters, seats all have different prices, right? And back then you had box seats, which were considered the most expensive seats in the house. You had the pit, which was cheaper seats, and was more rowdy kind of in general. And then you also had the gallery, which at that time was called a colored gallery, which was for free and enslaved Blacks, as well as drunks and prostitutes, was how, they defined it at the time. So it's kind of a crazy sort of catch-all there.
Yeah.
But so when the fire broke out, it affected, pretty much everyone in town to some degree. Everybody knew someone that was in the theater, or was, related to someone who was in the theater, or was in the theater themselves. The city of Richmond at the time only had about 10,000 people in it. And of those 10,000, 5,000 were white and 5,000 were Black. So, I wanted I wanted the book to convey what the real, city looked and felt like at that time, and what the audience looked and felt like at that time. And when you think about the fact that if 600 people were in the theater out of a total community of 10,000, that's a huge percentage of people who were affected. So I read a ton about the fire, and I looked for stories and individuals where I could, where I felt like their lives represented a particular experience that night. And then I went from there.
Yes, definitely. I loved reading from every character. I would say Cecily, in a way, touched my heart the most, because maybe I just felt the most for her terrible situation, which I won't go into too much about, so people who read the book can experience it for themselves. Sorry. No, you're totally fine.
Yeah. Okay. Using loud. Great.
Totally happens all the time. But no, I really appreciated that you portrayed the humanity of people who society at the time really wanted us to see as less than human. And I think that's why historical books like this are so important, to show us, like you said, the reality of the city. So many historical dramas or even novels sometimes only focus on the documented groups. And people say that's just how it was back then, which is always, I appreciate historical fiction like yourself, like your book, that sort of pushes back on, no, actually, there were always people of color in this country. There were always Black people in this country.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that happened with the writing of this book is that the book is set in 1811, right? So we're years and years before the Civil War. We're in Richmond, Virginia. For better or worse, slavery, I mean, obviously for worse, right? Slavery is a part of life. And I didn't necessarily set out to write a book about slavery. I wanted to write about the Richmond Theater Fire. But of course, slavery is naturally going to be woven into any story that you write, that's set in that era, in that location. And that it felt very natural when it did start to weave its way into the narrative. It felt like, of course it will, like, that makes sense. And, one of the challenges writing this book was that the South is ever evolving, right? In the 19th century, and particularly Richmond, because it will go on to become the capital of the Confederacy. And, there's of course a whole history. Sorry, I have two dogs and they're really
totally fine. We love dogs.
But, the city will continue to evolve. But in 1811, you've got, oh my God, they're really bad right now. I'm sorry.
No, it's all
right. You're fine.
It happens.
So in 1811, one of my challenges was that I needed to convey to readers that the city was not exactly set up the same way it would be set up by, say, 1861, right? Because it's an urban center, slavery looked different in an urban center than it did on a plantation, for instance. And you had free Blacks and enslaved Blacks working often right next to each other. And this is before they had to leave town. Down the road, Virginia will pass all of these laws that say, you know, once you're manumitted, you've got to get out of town, and, you know, you can't learn to read, and you can't, you know, a bunch of different laws will pass. But in 1811, we're not there yet. And so that also became a challenge, you know, to figure out with how I was going to tell the story and how I was going to convey the South of 1811.
Yes. It is definitely a region that even today is ever developing. As somebody in the Midwest, I know it's like a region that's getting a lot of negative press a lot of the time, while still you're there and you understand that there's all of this culture and history to it that maybe not everybody is seeing. But I was wondering, what made you choose the Richmond Theater Fire in the first place to write about?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a very pandemic central story. I'm sure you're talking to a lot of novelists now who say, you know, well, it was 2020 and I was sitting around, you know. I had been, you know, so Florence Adler Swims Forever, my first novel was finished. It was set to come out. It came out in July of 2020, which brought its own interesting challenges with it.
Yes.
But that summer, you know, I was sitting around kind of trying to think about, I had been working on a project kind of while I was waiting on Florence to come out. But it was a project that was going to require a lot of travel. And so when the pandemic hit, I had no idea when I would get to do any of that travel, or if I would get to, you know, I didn't know how long, you know, we weren't taking flights. The planes were literally grounded. Like where was I going to go, you know, and when, and, so that was causing me a lot of anxiety, and amongst many other things, like washing my groceries by hand and all of the things. And I really started to ask myself, like, well, Rachel, what is a story that you could spend the next couple of years on where you don't need to leave town? You know, something that you can write in your own backyard. And I had always been fascinated with the story of the Richmond Theater Fire. And it was something I felt very lucky to have learned about it when I did, because I moved to Richmond in 2007. And when I moved here, my husband had taken a job, actually at VCU, the big university right down the road. And the department head had put me in touch with a realtor and said, the next time you're in town, you know, they'll drive you around. So this realtor was just driving me around, kind of showing me neighborhoods and really just trying to orient me to the city. And we drove past Monumental Church, which is the church that was built on the site of the Richmond Theater Fire as a monument to the 72 people who had died. And he points out the window and he says, there used to be a theater there. You know, this church was built, and gave me a little bit of the history. And I remember just like my mouth falling open, you know, when he told that story. And I have had like zero more contact with that realtor. You know, it just was like a once in a life, you know, he just happened to find it. We happened to be driving by. And what's so funny is, you know, now the book's about to come out. I'm talking to people in Richmond all the time about the book. And tons of people tell me, they're like, oh my gosh, I've lived here 25 years and I had no idea about the Richmond Theater Fire. So it's not even a story that every Richmonder knows. It's like a story I would say maybe half of Richmond knows, or 25% of Richmond knows. There's, you know, like any city, we have a lot of newcomers and, you know, so I just got lucky that on my very first day in the city, somebody told me the story of the Richmond Theater Fire. And then as the pandemic was happening, as I was thinking, what am I going to write where I don't need to travel anywhere?
Yes.
It was like the natural kind of two ideas coming together at once.
Yeah, that is amazing. It's crazy how people who we interact with once or twice end up just influencing us in these huge ways.
I know. It's really funny.
And that was even something, I was a theater major in college. I work at a theater currently. And I actually hadn't heard of this fire, and I was kind of surprised because I'm sure modern theaters, luckily, a lot more fire safety going on than there was in the 1800s. So don't be afraid of your current local theater. But I was shocked that I hadn't heard of this, because I imagine a lot of our fire safety comes from this particular situation, or ones that were probably very similar to it on a maybe smaller scale that happened.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that is tricky to convey, because this fire happened so long ago and because it is so like little known now,
Mhm.
is that at the time the fire happened, it was like the equivalent of 9/11 or something. Like, it was a really, really big deal,
Mhm.
not just in Richmond, not just in Virginia, but all up and down the Eastern Seaboard. We'd never had this kind of single day calamity where everyone just kind of tragically in one go, died. And
Mhm.
then it was very widely reported. And became like a serious human interest story where, people in Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and, they were buying everything they could get their hands on. Like, printers were printing these commemorative books and,
Mhm.
um, whatchamacallit, the broadsides and, all of these commemorative details that the ephemera of the fire, so that people could have like souvenirs. It was strange, but
Yeah.
it really captured the national interest. And that's a hard thing to convey now, that like, no,
Mhm.
this thing really mattered to a lot of people.
Yes. And it's not like today where, something happens, we see it on the news, we see it on our phone. Back then, it was traveling via post, via letter, via word of mouth. So to capture what was the nation at that time was a lot harder than it is now for something to break all over like that.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, one of the big ways that word spread was through sermons. And
Mm.
I have a friend, Meredith Honey Baker. She's become my friend as the result of writing this novel. But she wrote the nonfiction version of the book about 11 years ago, which is called the Richmond Theater Fire. And she did all this research, but she's a public historian in town. And when she was getting her master's degree at William and Mary, she kept going through the William and Mary archives and finding all these old sermons by ministers from all over who were writing about the Richmond Theater Fire. And she couldn't figure out why all these ministers in different
Yeah.
parts of Virginia and the further she looked, the more she found these sermons. And it caused her to realize, like, oh, this fire was a really big deal. And
Mhm.
now I need to write about it. So she's the one who, I can credit with that nonfiction account.
Yeah, that is, I never would have guessed via sermons the news
Mhm.
traveling at all. But that is fascinating. And that is probably how a lot of people learned about national or even international ongoings, was just
Yeah.
in their church, because that's where everybody was.
Mhm. Yeah.
No, we have a fun audience question. Hi, Darlene. Thank you for being here. But yes, is your real estate agent mentioned in the acknowledgments?
I really should. I don't know if I gave him his proper due. Like, it was really, I'd have to find him first. So he may not have gotten his proper due. I need to, you know what, Darlene, you're inspiring me. I'm gonna Google him and see if he's still alive and
If he wants to get a shout out.
Right. Yeah.
Perfect. No, hopefully he is, and he appreciates that he made an amazing book come out into the world. So not all of us, have that happen. So
Right.
but yes, I was wondering, what, with your research process, I know you mentioned that you worked with Meredith. What other research did you really dive into?
Yeah. So I'm very lucky because I live in Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of great archives in the city that have really, devoted some real estate to the Richmond Theater Fire.
Mm-hmm.
So the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, which is formerly the Virginia Historical Society, they have a treasure trove about the Richmond Theater Fire.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the documents that kind of came out after the fact, like the inquest report and the newspaper articles and diary entries and all kinds of stuff, but also how people have responded in the years since. So poetry that was created, or plays, or different kind of artistic and cultural responses to the fire are documented with them. And then I'm also just down the street from the Library of Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
and they also have their own archive. And there was just so much for these organizations to pull from and to gather,
Yes.
because as I mentioned, with there being all of these commemorative items that were sold after the fact, a lot of Richmonders owned, books that had all of the clippings and all of the sermons and all of the inquest reports and everything in one place. And then you've got cross-stitch samplers and, all kind of early 19th century stuff you might imagine to come out of a disaster like this.
Yes.
Yeah. So there was actually a lot to use and to find. So I really did do my homework, and I hope that shows when people are reading the book.
Yes, I mean, I'm not by any means an expert on anywhere in the 1800s, but I certainly felt like I was really seeing the world sort of as it was. So, and as somebody who loves theater, who works in a theater, it's always fascinating for me to kind of read about how different it was. And especially one thing I think we forget is that actors were seen, and theater people were seen, very low on the societal totem pole. Like, now we just had the Oscars, we have these awards, there are celebrities, we love them. But back then, there was a time where actors couldn't even be buried in a Christian cemetery.
Yes, no one wanted to be associated with actors. And in fact, we've got this famous actor who I kind of mentioned briefly in the book, but she's not a starring role because she died a couple weeks before the fire. But you've got Eliza Poe, who was an actress, very popular actress in Richmond, with the same Charleston-based theater company that had been there for several months. And, of course, her son is Edgar Allan Poe. So, she dies of tuberculosis, and thankfully 2 families in Richmond took in her children and raised them. But yes, absolutely. The actors were kind of third-class citizens, and they really were living a life very much like unto themselves. And so you can envision, one of the storylines, and I don't want to give too much away, but is these actors kind of trying to figure out how they can pass the blame, right? And you can see why they would be tempted, because they know that they're potentially going to be held accountable because they are not on the inside. They do not have the power.
Yes, there's a very likelihood that they would choose to just execute all of them for all of this, which is, very scary thought. But it's possible that they would just view them as
what
guilty.
They do is far worse.
Also, yes, no, which we won't go into it to not spoil the book. But when you get there, it's just a real heart drop moment for sure. Hard to read, but yes, it's that beauty of historical fiction, the very heartbreaking beauty where you see how people who were in different terrible situations end up harming each other because it's the only group they are capable of enacting any sort of harm on. So they just shift the blame one tier lower.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
And it's a tragic thing that still happens today, but that was just a part of society and a part of being in those groups that were looked down upon.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that I saw again and again as I was researching and writing the book was, you think this is so long ago and what could it have to do with today? But there is plenty in terms of, there's plenty that was happening then where you can kind of trace the dotted line to a natural conclusion and see where we are today. Yeah.
No, and it's good that we are always, hopefully most of us are trying to work towards a more equitable world. Clearly, not all of us are, but hopefully most of us can keep working towards that.
Right.
But yes, I was wondering, you wrote from multiple point of views, 4 of them, very beautifully in this book. Is writing from multiple point of views what your preference is? Or do you prefer usually you write from one, you just felt the story required it?
Well, I mean, so I've written 2 novels. They've both been a multiple point of view. The first novel that I wrote, Florence Adler Swims Forever, was actually a little more ambitious. It was told from 7 points of view, but the points of view were almost all exclusively in the same family or very closely related to the family.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me did not feel like a stretch. Like it, it came pretty easily. I had the voices down. There was a really good reason why I felt like I needed it. And then this time around, I think my inclination would have been to not use multiple points of view, because I was thinking, oh, I want to challenge and I want to do something that, is different than what I've done before. But I did feel like with this book, it really called for it, because again, in both books, I was writing about grief and loss, and they were both aftermath stories, what people do, in the aftermath of like a great tragedy. And so I wanted to be in multiple heads because I knew that everyone had different responses to the tragedy at the theater. And so I set out to do it again. And I will say that while I'm only in 4 people's heads this time, I actually found it to be much more challenging because the people are not so closely related. One of my rules for myself as I was writing multiple point of view in this book was that I never wanted to have silly coincidences or like people bumping into each other and helping each other who would not have really helped each other in real life. Right. So, I didn't want to suddenly write a storyline where, an upper middle class white woman and an enslaved man become friends and work toward a greater good, right? Because that wasn't what was happening then, right? So I always wanted to be realistic, and that meant that their storylines had to be more separated. They each are really living their own lives, and then just kind of almost like bouncing off against each other, from time to time. And so, at times that made me feel like I was writing 4 novellas.
Yeah.
And I thought, what did I sign up for here? But I really do think it works. And one of the reasons I think it works is that the chapters are very short and there's a lot of action and we're moving very quickly. And so you're not with any person for very long before you cycle back around, again. And they're all in the same settings. So I don't know, for those reasons it worked. But like I'm working on a project now that is just going to have one point of view, I think. So I am capable of leaving multiple point of view in the dust.
No, I mean, I think it's totally fine to have a preference, but it is always fun to challenge yourself. But that was something, you mentioned it moving quickly, and that was something I noticed where I forget what page it was on, but I was like, oh, wow, like the fire is already starting, and I didn't expect things to move this fast in this book. And you think, like, it's so early, how can it keep going? And then it just really is a roller coaster ride the whole time of so many things happening. So it's a really thrilling read. It's an amazing read, and I definitely recommend it. And we also have Darlene. I'm glad that you loved Florence Adler Swims Forever.
Thank you, Darlene.
Yes. And definitely, Linda, check it out. It is an amazing book when it comes out in April. What's the exact date of its
this coming Tuesday, so April 4th.
Perfect. Yes, yeah. April 4th. Definitely check it out. Pre-order it. We have the bookshop link to pre-order it in our comments. And one other thing that I was wondering is, with this, did you sort of plot it out ahead of time, like where each character's arc would go, since they're all so separate from each other in this one event? Or did you just write them along as they came?
I'm trying to think how I did it now.
It's hard to remember sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, you reach a point where you look back at the book and you're like, that was magic that I managed to do that at all. Like you start to forget all the horrible days and nights where you had no idea what you were doing.
Yes.
But for a while I was writing every chapter in order, and I just knew, okay, it's Gilbert's turn, it's Cecily's turn, it's Sally's turn, whatever. And I tried to stay true to the order. I think that's how I got through kind of the first, like everything that happens in the fire. I just kind of kept moving back and forth between my characters. And then at a certain point, I realized, ooh, I'm not quite sure what to do about Jack, or I'm not quite sure what to do about whoever. And so I would just kind of stick with one character for a while and write them, knowing that I was writing multiple chapters, in a row. And then eventually they would be kind of like parsed out. And that worked for a while. And then I would say that like towards the end, I really did have to step back and look at the whole thing holistically and figure out like, oh wait, this point and this point are where two characters are bumping into each other, or they're going to pass in the street, or they're going to, one person's going to do something that influences another character. So that took a lot of pulling at the marionette strings and, trying to figure out, but I kind of did the approach that I think a lot of writers do, where I outlined the beginning to get me going. Like, okay, I think I know what's going to happen in this first section. Then I wrote kind of blindly, and then I would try to figure out what I had written, and then kind of almost outline in reverse. Like Matt Bell talks about that Used to Be Done, his craft book, where he's like, sometimes you've got to write a draft and then you go back and outline and you say, okay, I'm missing what I need here, here, and here, So that was kind of how I worked the second part of the book.
No, that's honestly excellent advice, to start with a draft and then go back and outline. It's something I haven't thought of before.
Yeah, that's what's worked for me, is like a half and half approach. Or just, if you are going to do a lot of outlining, I feel like you need to be the type of person that's willing to leave all that work in the dust and just say, that's not where the book ended up going. It ended up going over here.
No, that is being able to be flexible with yourself and with where your story needs to go is definitely an important trait for a writer. You mentioned you were working on something else now. Are you able to tell us a little bit about what that's about, or is it more under wraps for right now?
God, no.
No, totally fine.
Like, yeah, it would be a god-awful mess if I told you what it was.
Totally fine. All right. Susan D is asking, was it harder to write about a very specific actual event?
So both the books that I've written so far have been based on actual events. Florence Adler Swims Forever was based on a drowning that occurred in my family in 1929. So I had a great aunt who was training to swim the English Channel, and she drowned off the coast of Atlantic City. And when she died, the family made the decision not to tell her that her sister had died. The family made the decision not to tell her sister that she had died. Her sister being my great-grandmother. So my great-grandmother was pregnant. She was in the hospital on bed rest. And the family all kind of colluded on the secret to keep her from knowing that her sister was dead. So I had that kind of basic premise that it was a real story. And but I had to fill in so many details with true, honest to God fiction, because no one in my family could tell me much, right? Like we had the lore that we had been passing down for generations, but and I did a ton of research, but I still had to at the end of the day, I had to make a lot up. Now, that being said, if we move forward to the Richmond Theater Fire book, there was much more available to me about what had actually happened. I think in some ways it's a gift, because it gives you the structure a little, like, okay, all right, I'm not going to have the actors do something that's completely out of characteristic with what I know they did in real life. But I think overall it makes it harder, because you're left as a novelist to kind of write in the blank parts between the historical narrative, and there are fewer blank parts. So you've got to kind of be really careful with how you craft the story. I felt like I had a lot greater freedom with the first one, because yes, I wanted to be true to the story, but there was so much that was unknown that I could make up a lot. Does that answer the question?
No, I definitely think it did. It's writing in the blanks of history is, I think, a very good way of phrasing it. But it makes sense that with a personal family story that was not quite national news the way this was, you have a lot more freedom to wiggle it around. And, you know, if anyone's offended, maybe there's somebody who's related to
Well,
you.
No, thankfully they were not offended. But
good.
But yeah, I always, I went into writing Florence Adler always wanting very much to be like true to the essence of her story. And like, I wanted to portray it as honestly as I possibly could and to do right by her. She's this beautiful 19-year-old girl who had drowned. And so, I went in with all of the good intentions and love, in my heart, but, but there was still just so much less that was known. Yeah.
Yes. So I always like to ask this as a second to last question because we're kind of wrapping up now. And that is, did I not ask anything that you think I should have? Anything you want to talk about that I just didn't bring up?
I don't know. No, I mean, I think you did a great job.
Thank you. No, I always like... Sometimes I don't touch on something and someone's like, oh, I actually really wanted to talk about this part. So I always like to give people an opportunity. But
no, I think you did a nice job.
Thank you. Thank you. And now, what are you doing next and where can people follow you?
Well, for the next couple of weeks, I'll be on book tour. We're doing a big launch party in Richmond on Tuesday night, this coming Tuesday, the 4th, at Monumental Church, which is the church that was built on the theater site after it burned. And so that's going to be, I think, really special. It's a deconsecrated church now that's owned by Historic Richmond. And then I will jet off and go visit lots of bookstores and libraries and all kinds of good things and talk up the book. And then, eventually I'll be back in Richmond working on something new. You just put up my website. That's a great place to look for all of my events. And then I would say on social, you're most likely to find me like in an active capacity on Instagram. Yeah, good. You've got it ready to go. I was going to say Facebook, I do a kind of mediocre job with. So.
Totally fine. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Lit Fic this week, Rachel. And thank you all for being here, watching it. Remember to order The House is on Fire that releases April 4th. And please like, subscribe, and follow for more amazing blazing goodness and to see more amazing authors like Rachel. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.